My son's pediatric nurse used a routine checkup to destroy our family, but that wasn't even the worst part. You see, the bruising on his elbow was from a fall my son took at the playground. Completely innocent. But Geraldine didn't just examine it and tell us he would be okay like she was supposed to. Instead, she used his traumatic injury as an excuse to start checking in on our family, claiming she could help us through a difficult time. She started showing up at my husband's work with coffee, texting him about concerns for our son. When I found the texts between them 3 months later, I reported her to the hospital board immediately. But Geraldine came from a prominent medical family. Her father was chief of staff at the hospital, so the hospital board told me that without concrete proof of misconduct specifically during work hours, they couldn't act. My son's pediatric nurse was sleeping with my husband, and somehow this was ethical according to them. To pour salt in the wound, my own mother told me I should be grateful someone was looking out for my boy and that I was being paranoid, that the affair was all in my head. But it wasn't. It was out in the open now. Everybody knew they were sleeping. My coworkers made comments, and teachers at Charlie's school asked me how I was doing when Geraldine came to every school event, playing the concerned medical professional who was just trying to help. I had to switch pediatricians, driving 45 minutes each way because Geraldine worked at the only practice in town. My son would cry during the long drives, not understanding why we couldn't see Miss Geraldine anymore. The divorce was brutal. Geraldine testified as a medical expert about my fitness as a mother, using privileged medical information she'd gathered as our nurse. Every time my son had been sick, every question I'd asked, every concern I'd raised, she twisted it all, said I had medical anxiety that was harmful to my son, said the bruising incident showed I wasn't supervising him properly. The judge believed her. I got joint custody when I should have gotten full. The nursing board gave her a warning, but let her keep her license. She couldn't treat my son anymore, but that was it, a warning, for violating HIPAA, breaking up a family, and lying in court. She kept working at the practice, and I'd see her car there every time I drove past with my son. 3 years passed. 3 years of shared custody, of my son coming home talking about Miss Geraldine and the fun things she did with him at Daddy's house. Then my mother reached out. Geraldine had left my ex-husband for another married doctor at the practice, Dr. Harrison, whose wife had just had a baby. My mother was appalled. Suddenly she believed me about everything. I was wary, but my mother seemed genuinely remorseful. She became the perfect grandmother, attending every soccer game, hosting sleepovers, even paying for private school tuition. For a year, she was everything I'd needed her to be when Geraldine first destroyed my family. My son adored her, and I started to heal from the betrayal. One day I came home early from a business trip. My flight had been canceled and rebooked for an earlier time. I walked into my mother's house to pick up my son and found Geraldine in the living room, examining my son's ankle. He'd hurt it at soccer practice. My mother stood there watching like it was completely normal. "She's married to Dr. Harrison now," my mother said, like that made it better. "She's reformed, and she's the best pediatric nurse in the state." I couldn't let him suffer when free medical care was available. I looked at my son, who was shrinking away from Geraldine now that I was there. "How long?" I asked. "Just a few months," my mother said. "She's been so helpful." A few months. My son had been alone with the woman who destroyed our family for months, the woman who had violated his medical privacy, who had used him as a weapon in court. I grabbed my son and left. I immediately withdrew him from the private school my mother was paying for and filed a restraining order against Geraldine. My mother tried to set up a $50,000 college fund that I couldn't touch. Only my son could access it at 18. Her way of maintaining control, of staying in his life despite what she'd done. 6 months later, at my father's funeral, she had the audacity to sob about how she just wanted to help. "Geraldine's reformed," she kept saying. "She's married to Dr. Harrison now. She made a mistake, but she's a different person." I looked at her in that funeral home, surrounded by family who thought I was the unreasonable one, and I said, "When Dad was dying, did Geraldine help then too? Did you let her look at his medical records? Give her updates on his condition?" My mother went pale. Her silence was answer enough. "You let the woman who destroyed my family, who violated my son's privacy, who committed medical malpractice, near Dad in his final days, and you let her near my son. When you chose a predator over your grandson's safety twice, you lost the right to call yourself his grandmother." The funeral director stepped between us, his hands raised in that careful way people use when they don't want to pick sides. He asked if we needed a few minutes to collect ourselves before the service continued. I told him we were done here and took Charlie's hand. My mother reached for him, but I pulled him closer to me. The whispers from my aunts and cousins followed us down the aisle. I heard someone say I was being cruel on the day we buried Dad. Someone else said Mom was just trying to help. Charlie's hand was sweaty in mine as we pushed through the heavy wooden doors. The parking lot was full of cars with those little funeral flags on them. Charlie climbed into his booster seat without me having to ask. He buckled himself in while I started the car. We drove past the cemetery where they'd bury Dad in an hour. Charlie watched the headstones go by and asked why Grandma was crying so hard. I looked at him in the rearview mirror. His face was confused and sad. I told him sometimes adults make choices that hurt other people. Sometimes we have to protect ourselves from people who don't keep us safe, even when we love them. He nodded like he understood, but I knew he didn't really. That night after Charlie went to bed, I opened my laptop. I typed an email to Octavia Curtis, the lawyer who handled my divorce 3 years ago. I explained everything that happened at the funeral. I told her about finding Geraldine at my mother's house 6 months ago. I asked what legal options I had for keeping both of them away from Charlie permanently. I sent it at 11:30 and tried to sleep. Monday morning, my phone rang at 8:15. Octavia's voice was calm and professional. She suggested we pursue a formal restraining order against Geraldine based on the pattern of violations. She also said we should set up a court-approved communication app with my ex. Everything needed to be documented from now on. She'd send the paperwork by noon. Tuesday morning, I drove to the courthouse with a folder full of documents. The Civil Protective Order form was 12 pages long. I wrote down every detail about Geraldine's boundary violations and unauthorized medical treatment of Charlie. The clerk behind the bulletproof glass took my papers without looking up. She said a judge would review it within 72 hours. There was no guarantee of immediate protection. Wednesday, I called 3 different therapists before finding one who could see Charlie soon. Michaela Landry specialized in family trauma and had an opening next week. I scheduled the intake appointment and wrote it on the calendar. Charlie needed professional support to process all this. I also needed documentation of how this situation was affecting him. Thursday night, I sat at the kitchen table with bills spread everywhere. Without my mother paying for private school, our budget was tight. I moved numbers around on my calculator. If I cut back on extras and picked up overtime shifts, we could make it work. Charlie could go to public school starting next month. Friday morning, I woke up early to create a timeline. I started with the playground injury 3 years ago when Geraldine first inserted herself into our lives. I documented every incident, every boundary violation, every time she'd been alone with Charlie. Octavia had said documentation was everything in cases like this. The timeline filled 8 pages by the time I finished. Charlie's first therapy appointment with Michaela went better than I expected. He sat on the green couch in her office playing with a stress ball. She asked him gentle questions about his feelings. He told her his stomach hurt when Miss Geraldine was around. He said she made him nervous, but he didn't know why. Michaela took careful notes in her notebook. She told me privately she'd write a report for the court if we needed it. Saturday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from my ex. He was angry about me causing drama at my father's funeral. He said I was poisoning Charlie against his grandmother for no reason. He accused me of using Dad's death to manipulate everyone. I took screenshots of every message. I forwarded them all to Octavia with a note about the timestamp. She replied within an hour, reminding me that all communication needed to go through the new app once it got set up. She said his messages showed a pattern of harassment that would help our case. The weekend passed slowly with Charlie asking about Grandma twice. I kept my answers simple and focused on keeping him busy with activities. We went to the park and the library. We baked cookies and watched movies. Monday morning, Octavia called to say the judge had reviewed our protective order request. We'd have a hearing in 2 weeks to present our case. Until then, Geraldine couldn't come within 500 feet of Charlie's school. It wasn't much, but it was something. The next few days blurred together with legal prep and therapy appointments and figuring out our new normal without my mother's help. Octavia called Tuesday morning with a new idea about getting a parenting coordinator assigned to manage all communication between me and my ex. She explained it would mean another monthly expense on top of everything else, but could stop him from making decisions about Charlie's medical care without my input. I agreed to file the motion, even though money was already tight. The rest of that week, I spent hours at my computer filling out complaint forms for the state nursing board about Geraldine accessing my dad's medical records when she wasn't even assigned to his care team. The federal HIPAA violation portal took forever to load and kept timing out, but I finally got the complaint submitted late Saturday night. Both agencies sent back automated emails saying they'd review within 30 days, which felt like forever when Charlie was still going to his dad's house every other weekend. Sunday evening, Don showed up at my door carrying a casserole dish covered in foil. He didn't say much, just came in and sat at my kitchen table while I cried about losing my dad to cancer and my mom to her own choices. He heated up the food and made sure I ate something before leaving. Wednesday morning, I drove to the courthouse for the restraining order hearing wearing my only business suit. The judge listened to both sides for about 20 minutes before deciding she could only grant limited protection at Charlie's school and medical appointments. She said without more concrete evidence of current danger, she couldn't restrict broader contact, but warned both parties to maintain appropriate boundaries. My hands shook as I left the courtroom, knowing it wasn't enough to really protect Charlie. Thursday, I took Charlie to his new pediatrician 45 minutes away for his regular checkup. While the nurse took his vitals, I specifically asked the doctor to add a note to his file that no step-parents could make medical decisions or attend appointments without my written consent. The doctor understood immediately and flagged the account with a bright red alert in their system. Charlie asked why we had to drive so far for a doctor, and I told him sometimes we need to find people who understand our special situation. Friday afternoon, I heard a knock at the door and looked through the peephole to see my mother standing there holding a wrapped present. She called through the door that she didn't know I was serious about no contact and just wanted to drop off a birthday gift for Charlie, even though his birthday wasn't for 3 months. I didn't open the door and watched through the window as she finally left the package on the porch. Later that night, I emailed Octavia asking her to send my mother a formal letter stating all communication had to go through legal channels from now on. Monday morning, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, but I answered anyway. The man introduced himself as Rohit Bhatia, an investigator with the State Nursing Board, looking into my complaint about Geraldine. He said they were opening a preliminary inquiry and would need me to come in for a formal interview within 2 weeks. I grabbed my calendar and scheduled it immediately, feeling like someone was finally taking this seriously. Tuesday, the new parenting app my ex and I had to use for communication showed a message from him saying Geraldine was his wife now and had every right to make decisions about Charlie during his custody time. I screenshot it immediately and forwarded everything to Octavia, who responded within an hour with specific citations from our custody agreement that prohibited any third-party medical decisions without both parents' consent. She said this message alone showed he was already violating the court's orders. Wednesday morning, I went to Charlie's school to update his emergency contact information. I removed both my mother and Geraldine from the authorized pickup list and emergency contacts, explaining to the secretary that we were dealing with some family safety concerns. She was really understanding and added a special alert to Charlie's file that would pop up anytime someone tried to check him out or get information about him. The secretary even showed me how the alert would flash red on their computer screen. Saturday at Charlie's soccer practice, I was setting up my folding chair when the coach walked over and mentioned my mother had called the league office asking about the practice schedule and game locations. He said something felt off about the call, so he didn't give her any information and wanted to make sure I knew about it. Requested Reds is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. I thanked him and briefly explained we were dealing with some family safety issues that required keeping certain people away from Charlie. The coach nodded and said he'd personally make sure only I got schedule updates from now on. That night, I sat at my kitchen table looking at all the documentation I'd been collecting, organizing everything into labeled folders for the different agencies and legal proceedings. The next week, Michaela called me with her preliminary report after seeing Charlie for 3 sessions and said she was seeing clear signs of anxiety related to what she called boundary violations in his life. She recommended keeping his routines consistent with clear rules about who could make medical decisions and said she'd be willing to testify in court if we needed her to. I thanked her and added her report to my growing stack of evidence while Charlie played with his Legos in the living room, completely unaware of all the legal stuff happening around him. 2 days later, Octavia emailed saying the court had approved Jackson Watkins as our parenting coordinator after my ex finally agreed to the appointment, probably because his lawyer told him it would look bad if he refused. Jackson would handle all communication between us about Charlie and make sure we both followed the custody agreement, which meant no more angry texts at midnight or surprise changes to the pickup schedule. Our first meeting with Jackson happened at his office downtown, where he laid out the new rules we'd both have to follow. All communication had to go through email only, no texts or phone calls unless it was an emergency. Neither parent could make medical decisions without the other's written consent, and that specifically included any appointments with anyone who wasn't Charlie's official pediatrician. Custody exchanges would happen at the police station parking lot, which felt weird, but Jackson said neutral locations prevented problems. He warned us both that if we didn't follow these rules, we could face contempt of court charges, and the way he looked at my ex, when he said it made me think he already knew who would be the problem. That same afternoon, I drove to the hospital's privacy office and filled out a formal request for an accounting of all disclosures of my father's medical records, specifically wanting to know exactly what information Geraldine had accessed during his final weeks. The clerk said they had 30 days to respond under HIPAA rules, but when I explained there was an ongoing investigation, she made a note on my file and said they'd try to expedite it. 3 days later, I got a call from the privacy office saying they were taking my request seriously and had already started pulling the access logs, which was more action than I'd seen from them in years of complaints. My mother must have heard about the investigation because that night, a long email showed up in my inbox where she tried to justify everything, claiming Geraldine was just checking Dad's lab results to help us understand what was happening. Reading her minimize everything made my stomach turn, but I forwarded it straight to Octavia, who replied within minutes, saying this was perfect evidence of admission. Don came over for dinner that weekend, and while we were cleaning up, he mentioned he remembered my mother doing something similar years ago with their neighbor Mrs. Peterson's cancer diagnosis, always finding ways to get medical information she shouldn't have. The pattern suddenly became so clear that I had to sit down because my mother had been enabling boundary crossers my whole life. not just with Geraldine. Monday morning, I was checking the patient portal for Charlie's upcoming appointments when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The notes from his last pediatric visit 2 weeks ago showed Geraldine had been present in the exam room with my ex, even though the restraining order specifically said she couldn't be at Charlie's medical appointments. I immediately took screenshots of everything, documented the date and time I discovered it, and sent it all to Jackson with a formal complaint about the violation. Jackson responded within 2 hours, saying he was issuing a formal warning to my ex and would document this for the court, adding that repeated violations could result in custody modifications, which was exactly what I wanted to hear. He scheduled an emergency phone conference with my ex's lawyer that afternoon, and apparently my ex tried to argue that Geraldine was just there as his wife, not in any medical capacity, but Jackson shut that down fast. The warning went into the official court file, and Jackson reminded both of us that the judge would see every violation at our next review hearing in 2 months. Thursday was Charlie's regular therapy day with Michaela, and when I picked him up, she asked to talk to me privately while Charlie played with the waiting room toys. She said Charlie had mentioned his stomach hurt every Thursday morning before going to his dad's house for the weekend, and that this kind of physical anxiety symptom in kids usually meant something was really bothering him about the visits. She suggested we might need to revisit the custody schedule if his anxiety didn't improve soon, and said she'd document everything in her notes for the court. I watched Charlie playing with the toy trains, looking so small and innocent, and felt that familiar anger rise up that he was going through this because adults couldn't follow simple rules about boundaries. That night I sat with him while he ate dinner and tried to keep things normal, asking about school and his friends, but I could see the worry in his eyes when he remembered tomorrow was Friday and he'd have to go to Dad's house. I gave him an extra long hug at bedtime and promised him everything would be okay, even though I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Saturday morning, the hospital privacy office finally sent the accounting I'd been waiting for, and my hands shook as I opened the thick envelope. The report showed Miss had accessed my father's medical records 17 different times over his last 3 weeks, even though she wasn't assigned to his care team or even working in that department. Each access was logged with dates and times, and what sections she viewed, including his lab results, medication lists, and doctor's notes about his declining condition. I scanned every page into my computer and forwarded the whole file to Rohit, with a short note about this being clear proof of HIPAA violations, since there was no medical reason for a pediatric nurse to be looking at an adult cancer patient's records. Rohit called me back within an hour and scheduled my formal interview for the following Thursday afternoon at his office downtown. He explained that the investigation process would take several months and that I'd need to provide a sworn statement about everything that had happened with Miss violating our family's privacy. He warned me that even with this evidence, medical professionals usually got light penalties for HIPAA violations, maybe just extra training or a small fine, which made me want to throw my phone against the wall. That same afternoon, I sat down and typed out a final email to my mother, stating that all future communication had to be in writing, and that any attempts to see Charlie in person would be considered harassment, and I'd call the police. She responded within minutes saying I was being cruel and heartless to cut her off from her only grandchild, but she agreed to follow my terms if that's what it took to stay in his life somehow. Monday morning, I got a call from Octavia telling me my ex had filed a motion with the court claiming I was harassing him with false complaints about Miss and trying to interfere with his parenting time. Octavia spent the rest of the day drafting a detailed response that listed every documented violation, including the restraining order breach at Charlie's doctor appointment and the new evidence about my father's medical records. The status conference happened Wednesday afternoon, and the judge listened to both lawyers argue for 20 minutes before declining to sanction either party. She scheduled another review hearing in 90 days and made it clear that Jackson's authority as parenting coordinator had to be respected by both parents, or there would be consequences. Thursday night, Charlie came into my room crying and asked if he could skip his weekend with Dad because his stomach hurt too bad to go. I held him close and explained that we had to follow the court order, but I'd asked Jackson to set up a special phone call for Wednesday so Charlie could talk to me if he needed to. Jackson agreed to the midweek check-in and sent both parents an email confirming the new arrangement would start immediately. Saturday afternoon, Don came over with takeout, and while we were eating, he showed me something on his phone that made my stomach drop. He'd found a social media post from 3 weeks ago where Miss was wearing scrubs and standing in the hospital hallway with a caption about working a double shift, which was during the exact time my dad was in his final decline. I took a screenshot, but resisted posting anything public about what she might have been doing there since Octavia had warned me about making accusations online. The following Tuesday, Rohit called to tell me he'd interviewed my mother as part of the investigation, and she'd admitted to sharing my father's medical updates with Miss, including his room number and visiting hours. My mother apparently thought it was perfectly normal to share this private information with someone who'd destroyed our family, which just showed how messed up her boundaries were. Rohit said this admission strengthened the case significantly, and he was expanding the investigation to include the medical practice where Miss worked. He sent them a formal notice requesting access logs for their computer systems and documentation about their privacy training procedures for all staff members. The practice responded 3 days later with a generic letter about how they took patient privacy very seriously and conducted annual HIPAA training for all employees. Their defensive tone and the fact they didn't actually provide the requested documents told me they knew they'd failed to handle the situation properly. The letter went on about their commitment to excellence and patient care, but didn't address why they'd kept Miss employed after multiple complaints about boundary violations. I forwarded everything to Octavia, who said the practice's response would actually help our case because it showed a pattern of ignoring serious problems. Meanwhile, Charlie's anxiety about going to his dad's house kept getting worse, and Michaela documented everything in her therapy notes for the court review. The whole situation felt like fighting a system that protected the wrong people, while my son suffered the consequences of adults who couldn't follow basic rules about privacy and boundaries. That Wednesday, Michaela spent the whole session working with Charlie on what to say when grown-ups tried to talk about doctor stuff without me around. She had him practice saying the words over and over in her office while I watched through the little window in the door. Charlie stood up straight and said it clear and strong each time she pretended to be someone asking about his health. She gave him a sticker every time he got it right, and by the end, he could say it without looking nervous. The next morning, Jackson sent an email saying all custody exchanges would happen at the police station parking lot starting that weekend. He attached a map showing exactly where we should park and said both parents had to stay in their cars while Charlie walked between them. My ex sent 3 angry messages through the app about how ridiculous this was, but Jackson just replied with the same message each time about following the new protocol. Friday afternoon, the school counselor called to tell me she'd set up a special plan for Charlie on the days he came back from his dad's house. She'd check in with him first thing in the morning, and he could go to her office anytime he felt upset instead of staying in class. She also gave him a special pass he could show his teacher if he needed to leave without explaining why. My ex complained through the app that night about what he called our performance of boundaries and said we were traumatizing Charlie with all these rules. Jackson responded within an hour, reminding him that following the custody agreement wasn't optional and any violations would be reported to the court. The hospital privacy office called Monday morning to tell me they were sending everything to their compliance committee for a full review. The woman on the phone said this was more serious than their usual process and they'd need statements from everyone involved, including my mother. Tuesday, my car started making a terrible grinding noise when I tried to start it, and the mechanic said the whole transmission needed replacing. Don came over that afternoon and spent 2 hours calling around to find someone who could fix it cheaper, and then just handed me his truck keys and told me to use it as long as I needed. Wednesday, a thick envelope arrived from my mother with paperwork for a college savings plan she wanted to set up for Charlie. I read through all 20 pages and called Octavia, who helped me write back saying I'd only agree if a bank trustee controlled it instead of her. My mother actually agreed 2 days later and sent the revised paperwork with the bank's information already filled in. During all the back-and-forth emails about my dad's estate that week, my mother kept mentioning how she'd always used money to help family and couldn't understand why I was being so difficult about everything. I printed every email and highlighted the parts where she talked about using money for control and gave them to Octavia for our files. Thursday morning, Rohit called asking for a sworn statement about everything that happened with Miss from the beginning. I spent 6 hours that night writing down every single thing I could remember from the playground injury to finding her at my mother's house. I included dates and times when I had them and attached copies of text messages and emails and even the screenshot Don had found on social media. Writing it all down in order made me realize how many times people were ignored what she was doing, and I felt stronger seeing it all documented properly. I signed the statement in front of a notary Friday morning and overnighted it to Rohit's office with all the supporting documents organized in a binder. The following Monday, Rohit called to say the medical practice had quietly moved Miss away from any pediatric duties while they investigated. She was still working there, but only with adult patients now, and couldn't access any children's records in their system. It wasn't close to enough punishment, but at least Charlie wouldn't run into her if we ever had to go back to that practice for some emergency. That night around 3 a.m, Charlie started crying, and when I ran to his room, he was sitting up in bed shaking and told me someone was trying to take him away. I pulled him into my lap and held him tight while he cried into my shoulder, and I could feel his little heart beating so fast against my chest. I rubbed his back and told him nobody was going to take him anywhere, and we were safe in our house with all the doors locked. He finally fell back asleep in my bed, and I stayed awake watching him breathe and thinking about how all this mess was hurting him more than anyone else. The next morning, I made his favorite pancakes, and we stuck to our normal routine of getting dressed and brushing teeth and packing his backpack, because keeping things normal seemed to help him feel better. 2 weeks later, Octavia called to tell me the hospital compliance committee finished their review and found that Geraldine did violate HIPAA rules when she looked at my dad's records. They gave her a formal reprimand that would go in her permanent file, and she had to do mandatory retraining on patient privacy, and they moved her away from pediatrics for 6 months. Octavia said it wasn't the license suspension we wanted, but at least there was official documentation now that she'd broken the rules, and that could help us if she did something again. I felt mad that she was still working as a nurse, but at least Charlie wouldn't see her if we ever had to go to that practice. The 90-day custody review came up faster than I expected, and Jackson sent me all the documentation he'd been keeping about my ex, following the rules, and the times he hadn't. The judge read through everything and asked a few questions about Charlie's therapy and how the exchanges were going at the police station. She changed the custody order so my ex had to bring Charlie back by 5 on Sundays instead of 7, and she put in writing that nobody except parents could take Charlie to medical appointments without written permission from both of us. Jackson said these were small wins, but they added up to better protection for Charlie over time. After the hearing, my ex started using the app exactly how he was supposed to and stopped trying to argue about every little thing. He'd send short messages about pickup times and if Charlie needed anything for school, and that was it. The tension was still there, but at least we weren't fighting in front of Charlie anymore, and the exchanges got easier when we didn't have to talk. A month later, I got a thick envelope from my mother with a 3-page letter inside. She wrote about how she understood now that she'd hurt us by letting Geraldine near Charlie and my dad, and she listed specific things she'd done wrong instead of making excuses. She said she wanted to try supervised visits at the library once a month if I was okay with it, and she promised not to talk about medical stuff or try to change my rules. I read the letter 5 times and showed it to Octavia, who said it seemed genuine, but to be careful. I wrote back saying we could try one visit and see how it went, but I'd be there the whole time, and if she broke any rules, we were done. The first library visit happened on a Saturday morning, and I picked a table where I could see everything. My mother brought puzzles and books and sat with Charlie reading stories and helping him build a castle with the blocks they had in the kids section. She didn't mention doctors or medicine or anything about his health, and when Charlie asked if she was coming to his soccer game, she looked at me first before answering. Charlie had fun and seemed happy to see her, and when our hour was up, she gave him a quick hug and left without trying to push for more time. At Charlie's next therapy appointment, Michaela said his stomach aches had gotten much better, and he wasn't complaining about them as much. She showed me her notes from the past few sessions and pointed out how he was talking more about school and friends instead of worrying about grown-up problems. She suggested we could go to every other week instead of weekly, since he was doing so well with the structure we'd created. I felt proud that all the work we'd been doing was actually helping him feel safer. My boss called me into her office the next week and said she'd approved my request for a flexible schedule, so I could handle custody stuff better. She let me work from home on exchange days and said I could make up hours in the evening if I needed to leave for appointments. Don heard about it and switched his shifts around so he could help with pickup or drop-off if something came up with my schedule. Having people actually support us made everything feel less overwhelming. 3 days later, Rohit called to tell me he was closing the investigation. The practice got an advisory notice about their privacy training, and they had to update their policies, but Geraldine kept her license. He said he knew it was frustrating, but the formal reprimand and mandatory reassignment were more than most nurses got for HIPAA violations, and at least there was a paper trail now if she messed up again. I thanked him for trying and hung up, feeling disappointed but not surprised, because I'd learned the system protected medical professionals more than patients. The best news came when the magnet school called to say they had a spot for Charlie starting the next month. It was only 10 minutes from our house instead of the 45-minute drive to his old private school, and they had a great science program he was excited about. We went to visit, and Charlie loved the playground and the library, and asked if he could start right away. Filling out all the enrollment papers felt like closing a chapter on the mess my mother had created with her money and control. Charlie picked out a new backpack and lunchbox for his fresh start, and I watched him practice writing his name on his new notebooks, thinking about how much calmer our mornings would be without that long drive. 2 weeks later, I took Charlie to his new doctor for his regular checkup and watched the receptionist pull up his file on the computer. She pointed at a bright red banner across the top that said, "Custody Restrictions, C Notes," and asked me to confirm I was the primary medical decision-maker. The doctor came in and showed me the whole system they had in place with passwords and photo IDs required for any non-parent trying to get medical information. He said they took these cases seriously after seeing too many kids get caught in the middle of messy divorces. Charlie sat on the exam table swinging his legs and drawing pictures while we talked about his health history, and I felt relief knowing this office actually understood what we needed. The next morning, Jackson sent an email saying my ex had called about a travel soccer tournament coming up that would mean Charlie missing 2 days of school. I expected another fight, but Jackson said my ex actually suggested skipping it since Charlie had been stressed lately and needed routine more than another competition. I read the email 3 times because I couldn't believe my ex was putting Charlie first instead of trying to win Parent of the Year through sports. Jackson said this was progress, and we should acknowledge it when parents made good choices, even if the relationship was still difficult. I drove out to the cemetery on Saturday, while Charlie was at his dad's house, and found my father's headstone covered in fallen leaves. I sat there cleaning them off and told him about all the boundaries I'd set up and how I wasn't letting Mom or Geraldine near Charlie anymore without supervision. The sun was setting and the cemetery was quiet, and I told him I wished he could see how strong Charlie was getting despite everything. I said protecting Charlie was the best way I could honor his memory, since he'd always put family first, even when it was hard. Monday afternoon, Charlie's teacher sent home a folder with his latest reading assessment and a note saying he'd jumped 2 reading levels since starting at the new school. She wrote that he was making friends and participating in class discussions, and his work showed real creativity and effort. For the first time in months, the communication from the school was about his actual progress, instead of concerns about behavior or signs of stress from our family situation. Charlie was proud and asked if we could put the report on the refrigerator next to his art projects. Tuesday morning, a package arrived from my mother with books and puzzles for Charlie, and a note saying she'd found them at a garage sale and thought he might like them. She didn't try to drop them off or ask to see him, and the note was short without any guilt trips or mentions of missing him. Later that week at the library visit, she showed up right on time and spent the whole hour reading stories and helping him with a dinosaur puzzle without once mentioning anything medical or asking about his father. Charlie seemed comfortable and happy during the visit, and when our hour ended, she gave him a quick hug and left without trying to extend the time or make plans outside our agreement. I sat in my car after dropping Charlie at the school on Wednesday and felt the anger rise up again thinking about Geraldine and everything she'd taken from us. But then I looked at Charlie's artwork hanging from the rearview mirror and made myself focus on the good stuff happening now instead of dwelling on injustices that might never get fixed. Charlie was doing better in the school and therapy and making friends, and that mattered more than whether Geraldine faced real consequences. I was choosing to put my energy into building our daily life instead of fighting battles that just drained us both. Thursday afternoon, Jackson called us both in for what he said would be our last official meeting since the 6-month coordination period was ending. My ex showed up on time, and we sat at opposite ends of the conference table while Jackson went through all the protocols we'd established. He had us both sign an agreement to keep following the communication app rules and custody exchange procedures even after his official involvement ended. My ex actually agreed without arguing and said the structure was helping Charlie, and he wanted to keep things stable. Jackson said we'd found a rhythm that worked, and he was confident we could maintain it on our own, as long as we kept putting Charlie first. Friday morning, I woke up early to pack Charlie's lunch, while he sat at the kitchen table telling me about his friend's birthday party this weekend at the bowling alley. He was excited about giving his friend the present we'd picked out together, and asked if he could wear his favorite shirt. My ex sent a text through the app confirming he'd pick Charlie up at noon on Sunday and drop him at the party before his custody time ended. It was simple and direct, without any extra commentary or attempts to change plans at the last minute. I zipped up Charlie's lunchbox and helped him get his backpack ready, and we headed out to the car for school drop-off. Life wasn't perfect, and probably never would be, but we'd built something steady and safe that let Charlie be a regular kid most of the time. That was enough for now. That's the end, folks. Bet you didn't think you'd stick it out this long, huh? If you're still here, might as well subscribe and make it official.